On this third Sunday after the resurrection, we have a beautifully constructed narrative of new life breaking into the midst of shattered hopes. And we are immediately thrown into the maelstrom of events when, on that same day as the tomb is found empty, we meet two of Jesus' disciples on a journey from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus, 7 miles away. We know one disciple is named Cleopas and the other is unnamed, leading some scholars to suggest that she was the wife of Cleopas, which adds an interesting dimension to the story. They are discussing in an excited, animated and emotional way all that has happened, how Jesus had taught and healed, how that same Jesus was betrayed, flogged and made a spectacle of shame, and how again that same Jesus breathed his last and was laid in a sealed tomb. Added to all this, it's reported that Jesus' body is now missing. Confusion reigns and the questions are flying. How could this happen? Has he been taken? What are we going to do now? But we had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel, they sigh, showing the deep pain and profound disappointment that they feel. This man Jesus was the longed-for one who would restore Israel, set the oppressed free, lift up the lowly, and fill the hungry with good things. A hope built upon hope for centuries. And now he was dead and the dream in tatters. Imagine the weight of grief, the intensity of loss, the sense of disillusion with God and with life, and fear of what now would happen in the future. The Emmaus Road is a familiar one to many, whether in the past or in the present. A road dotted with defeat, marked by disappointment, inevitable questions arising, and crushed hopes. But the beauty of this story of walking and talking is that it conjures a wonderful picture of deep companionship and of the living God coming alongside us in moments of loss, despondency, and shattered hopes, whether we realize it or not. It speaks of a God who is with us in the midst of our messy lives. And in this story of deep companionship, it is Jesus who initiates the conversation when he asks, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And in their grief and entangled emotions, the disciples have no idea who he is. But Jesus hears their stories, filled with a sense of disappointment, at the core of which, as Steve so eloquently communicated in his sermon last week, is absence. And the two disciples are sharing on an emotional level. This is no intellectual conversation. Their shattered hopes and confusion are spilled out before this stranger, who listens intently and engages wholeheartedly. The disciples go on to tell this stranger, "The women went to the tomb but didn't find him." The irony is surely not lost. Though Jesus is in front of their eyes, the disciples fail to see him. "Have you not heard the prophets? Have their words not sunk in?" Jesus asks. "Remember Moses and your forebears in the faith. Remember the prophets. Remember the scriptures dripping with promise of a Messiah like me and foretelling these events." And as Jesus talks and explains the scripture, they reflect later that their hearts were burning within them. "Were not our hearts burning within us," they say, a phrase that I love, because it expresses the truth that an encounter with the divine, with the living God, is not just an intellectual understanding, but a deep-felt emotional experience. It is this burning in the heart, this heart knowledge, that is at the core of their transformation, and which allows them to later perceive the reality of who Jesus is. In Measure for Measure, Shakespeare writes, "Go to your bosom, knock there, and ask your heart what it does know." Good advice for these two disciples, and also for us. We need to know things with our minds, which is why Jesus so patiently explains what happened and how the prophets foretold these events. But the best and the most precious truth and beautiful relationships are felt also on an emotional level. But still, as they walk and talk, there are still clouds in their minds that obscure their vision, something typical of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. Remember Easter Day when Mary Magdalene confuses the risen Christ for a gardener, and last week when it takes time for the disciples' eyes to recognize what appears like a ghost as the risen Christ himself. These disciples are in what Richard Rohr calls liminal space, that is so crucial for our growth and transformation. The Latin root limen literally means threshold, referring to that place which is a space between two places. And on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, the two disciples were leaving behind their old life and were suspended in a place of doubt, confusion, emptiness, and powerlessness. And before them was an unknown future, a space not unlike what many are feeling at this present time. And the disciples were no doubt wrung out emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And the breakthrough out of this liminal space doesn't come until Jesus succumbs to their persistent request to stay with them and have a meal in their home, typical of Middle Eastern hospitality. And as in the case in a number of the post-resurrection stories, food plays a critical role in the opening of eyes. And it is only when Jesus takes the bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and gives it to the disciples that their eyes are open. Why is this the moment of revelation? I think firstly it affirms the importance of the material, that Jesus' resurrection isn't just spiritual but physical, that life after death is not just about going to heaven but has relevance to the here and now, and that Jesus is to be found here in the ordinary stuff of this world, not amongst the dead. Secondly, Jesus giving thanks and breaking bread would immediately, for the two disciples, resonate with events at the Last Supper, when Jesus said he would not eat with them until the Passover had been fulfilled. In this simple action of blessing, breaking, and giving of bread, something dramatic happens. The disciples start to see with resurrection eyes, and they become open to the realities of the resurrection. And thirdly, revelation comes in the breaking of the bread. And throughout Scripture it seems that God has a preferential option for brokenness, which we see repeatedly in the life, death, and ministry of Jesus, who constantly gravitates towards those whose lives are split open by sickness, loss, or disappointment. It is in the brokenness of our humanity where we are most receptive to receive the divine and see the resurrected life of Christ. It is precisely in that moment when the sun is setting on their hopes for Israel's redemptions, their lives being broken open and dreams scattered, that Jesus comes alongside the disciples on that dusty road and opens up the Scriptures, burns in their hearts, and in the breaking of the bread reveals himself to them, creating in them a new foundation of hope and for life itself. And the wonderful thing about the Emmaus story is that it is a story which happens again and again throughout history, where Jesus continues to travel alongside us and walk with us, whether we are aware of it or not, particularly in our and others' brokenness, and continues to make our hearts burn inside us. The affirmation in this story is that Jesus still lives, and is grounded in the experience of Christians throughout the centuries, and is the reason why we continue to rejoice in Easter. May our hearts be open to his presence in our lives and in the world. Amen.